Welcome to the fourth and final session of Aarhus Symposium 2015. Without further ado, I would like to present our moderator for this session. He's managing editor at Børsen, and he's a familiar face here at Aarhus Symposium, and I'm glad to welcome him back. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jørgen Andresen.
Thank you. First of all, I'm happy to see that some of you are still not in the Friday bar, but here. That's nice to see. Secondly, our guest today is perhaps one of the most influential politicians we have in Europe. Perhaps not now, but it's not long ago she was. Commissioner, what you call it, environment minister in Denmark for 3 years. But before that, and something that you must not forget, she was selling ice creams in Holbæk with her father's ice stand. Yeah, and she has been a scout. And being a scout in Denmark might have taken her to her fantastic work for the environment worldwide. So I beg you to welcome warmly Connie Hedegaard.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jørgen Andresen, also for this slightly alternative introduction. Thanks a lot. Can I just for my information, how many were just in at the debate there? Oh my goodness. That was what I thought. So I'll try to sort of not repeat some of the points made in there, although that might be difficult. But I'll try to set the scene slightly different. You know, it's a paradoxical world that we are living in. We have global markets, we have global finances, we have global competition, we have global challenges, inequality, immigrants, refugees, climate, just to mention a few. And yet we have very weak global policies. Yes, we have the United Nations, but we all know how difficult it is for 195 countries, or sometimes even more, depending on which kind of forum it is, when they will have to agree anything. And the problem is also that the international democratic system is very slow at agreeing things. So whether it is ISIS, or Syria, or Ukraine, or whatever, it's really difficult for the world to get its act together on solving at the political level, the politicians sort of part of the responsibility for solving global challenges. Then we have organizations like, say, G7, used to be G8, now Russia's out for the time being. We have G20, and they are meeting now and then. They will be meeting in the next few days in Turkey. And it's clear they are doing things, they are discussing, but they only have very, very weak power. They can send out declarations, but they cannot enforce whatever they have agreed. So we have a paradox there. And climate is, in a sense, sort of a symbol of how difficult it is for the global community to get its act together. Although everyone can see that it's a global challenge that really need a coherent global response. The world started to take it seriously by making the Climate Convention back in 1992. We had the Kyoto Agreement in 1997. Now they're trying, some weeks from now in Paris, to sort of negotiate the next steps, building on the works that have been done in the last 10 to 15 years. But before we go into sort of the solution part of it, I would like to show to you just a small movie. You know, I could explain to you a lot about what climate change is all about, but I also had a background in journalism, and there we say, don't tell it, show it. So here runs a movie. I'm sure it's not going to get the Oscars. It's not fiction, but it's facts. It is how the temperatures around the planet has actually been measured. I mean, very concretely around different measuring stations around the planet since, as you saw, 1880. Where it gets bluish, it gets colder. Where it gets yellow, orange, red, it gets warmer. And you can see it goes up, it goes down, it's warmer, it's cooler. There isn't a lot of interesting things to report of. But then Try and watch. You know, this is what a world that has as an average warmed by 0.8 degrees Celsius is looking like. And the world leaders in Copenhagen in 2009 decided we should try and stay below 2 degrees. But I think this is sort of showing very clearly how come that the scientists tell us that 9 out of the last 10 years have been the warmest ever recorded, with 2014 having the global record. Only a few weeks still, as scientists tell us that 2015 probably will turn out being even warmer. 39 years in a row, we have had an average global temperature above the average of the 20th century. I'm not going to bore you with more statistics. I just think that this shows why some of us say this is something we have to take seriously. Also because if you look at it, where is it it's getting hotter, for instance? Yeah, take a look, for instance, on the Middle East. Just as an example, it's an area where, while we have to handle climate change, we have the double challenge in the fact that we are getting more and more people on planet Earth. When you will be my age, we will be probably around 10 billion people on planet Earth, all wanting a share in the good life, in water, food, mobility, energy, cooling, heating, whatever. So that's what I call the double challenge. Now, if you look at that Middle East, it might come as a surprise to some, but more and more studies coming out these years and months, lately from University College London and Columbia University in the US, sort of make the link between the civil war in Syria and climate change. How come? Because in Syria and in the whole region, as the movie actually sort of indicated, they had a drought of historical proportions starting in 2007, running into 8, 9, 10. And it became so severe that 1.5 million Syrians fled the rural areas because they could not make an existence there. They fled to the cities. The cities were already challenged by many refugees from the Iraq wars. And as you all know, we have an authoritarian regime in Syria. So they had other challenges, obviously. But this is just one of many examples of what Pentagon calls climate as a threat multiplier. It is worsening other challenges, it's worsening other threats. You could argue the same for Mali, you could argue the same for the Philippines, many, many places around the world. And when you look at this is why some of us say, wow, we better try and find a way where we can sort of slow down the development of this movie. Because when you couple it to the other part of the equation, there's still more people on planet Earth. In my view, there is absolutely no question that those who argue that now we should slow down growth, that should be the response to the climate and environmental challenges. I mean, forget about it. Whether you want it or not, it's not going to happen. In this world, with still more people, and still more people entering the global consuming middle classes, which is a global success story, there is no doubt that we will get a lot of growth. And we need a lot of growth. So the question is not growth or no growth. In my view, it has to be what kind of growth. How to sort of create growth that is more resource efficient, more energy efficient, less dependent on fossil fuels. That must be what it is all about. The world has known this for a very, very long time. We have been negotiating an international framework around these things at the international climate conferences and in many other contexts. But the world has been playing what I call the after you, sir game. What do I mean by that? Well, for really many years, the Americans have said, we're not going to do anything as long as our competitors in China will not be doing anything. So we are waiting for the Chinese. And obviously the Chinese have said we are newly industrialized, we are still a developing country, they would argue. We don't do anything until the Americans move. So there has been this after-user syndrome with the two biggest emitters of the world, which is now US and China. They have not really wanting to play ball here. In the European Union, we said already almost 10 years ago, we have to be serious about this. We have to take our moral responsibility. We have to become also less energy dependent. Europe is the region in the world most dependent on importing fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas from outside. During the crisis years we've just been through, each year as an average, we paid net 400 billion euros for our imported fossil fuels in Europe. 400 billion euros, it's 3,000 milliarder kroner. It's quite a lot. Around 1/3 of that ended up in the Russian pockets. Hope Putin spent the money well. That kind of energy dependency comes at an economic cost, but it also comes at a political cost. So just to say there's a lot of course, also geostrategic elements in why we have an interest in Europe in trying to addressing climate change. So we set up our targets for 2020. We should reduce our emissions, we should have more energy efficiency, more renewables. And as many of you will know, last year we managed to get through with 28 heads of states of Europe the targets for 2030. 1 month after that decision was taken unanimously by the 28 heads of states in Europe, China and US President Obama and President Xi Jinping came out of their G2 meeting, not sort of physically hand in hand, but almost hand in hand, announcing that now for the first time ever, they would both announce what they're going to do about climate. That was a significant step, and that is what gives some of us some sort of belief that there should be a chance that the upcoming International Climate Conference in Paris can actually deliver some results. I would say in Europe, that we managed to get that decision through, that by 2030, we should reduce emissions in Europe domestically through domestic action in Europe, not by buying projects elsewhere. We can still do that. But we have also to reduce in our own countries. The reason why we could the reason why we could get through with that in the midst of a crisis was because it was possible also to make a credible economic case, showing that the energy dependency is costly, as I just mentioned, showing that to become more energy efficient, retrofitting houses, retrofitting pipelines in Poland and Romania and Bulgaria and what have we, of inefficient energy systems, reusing things, recycling things, it's quite labor intensive. And during the crisis year in Europe, we could see that not many sectors managed to create more jobs, but the green sector was one of the very few sectors who actually managed to contribute to the European economy with net job creation. So we could, in other words, show it makes economic sense, it makes social sense, and of course it then makes sense for climate. I think that is what is now sort of getting into the overall international debate, that people can see that this is not something that is easy. It's not something that comes for free. It's not that it costs nothing, but it is cheaper than the alternative to continue business as usual. That's something that is very difficult to handle. I mean, it's not just in finance ministries, but I think many of us have this tendency to believe that if we continue to do tomorrow what went okay yesterday, if we continue business as usual, then we will get business as usual. It's hard to understand that, no, when it comes to climate, if we are not doing anything, then this movie will accelerate and we will have a lot of change that we haven't foreseen, that we haven't planned, that we have not been prepared for, and that is definitely extremely costly. It goes without saying that it's not enough that Europe, accounting for 10% of the global emissions, that Europe is serious about these things. You can be a front runner only for so and so long. You need others, you need your competitors to follow. As I mentioned, China is now starting to get this message because they are drowning in pollution. Do not know how many of you have been to China. Probably not too many yet. I can tell you if you sort of go out half an hour in Beijing or in Chongqing in Western China, wherever it is, after half an hour you feel it in your throat. The pollution is just incredible. I once went to the check-in counter at Beijing airport, and when we entered the building, we were in the building, you could not see the check-in counter because the smog was just there. I mean, that's the kind of problems we are talking about. So it's just to say that China have slowly started to realize that their growth model to grow first and clean up later came at a very, very high price. So they start now, because of air pollution, water pollution, resource challenges, they start to get serious about climate change because they see that it's also in their own interest. If they cannot accommodate these basic needs of people to have fresh air and water and whatever, it threatens the social stability of China, which is priority number one for the Chinese leadership. I would say for the Americans, well, that has been a long story. The Americans do not like binding international treaties, things like that. That's not part of sort of the natural way of doing things in the US. It's more natural for us in Europe. Why? Because 28 states can only cooperate the way we do with a single market and binding this and that if we actually are accountable to one another. So it's part of European tradition to accept that if you want to move here, then it's okay to have binding legislation. To the Chinese and the Americans, this notion of committing in a binding way internationally, they simply do not really see why is that. The Chinese will say, you can just read our 5-year plan, that is what we're going to do, no matter what the rest of the world says. And the Americans will say, it's too complex, we cannot get it through our Congress, which is right. Nonetheless, they are moving now because President Obama personally sort of gets this and can see that to claim that you are the leader of the world's only superpower in the 21st century, beginning of the 21st century, and yet is not being seen as being serious about one of these big challenges, then you have a problem. So I think there are many reasons why the Americans are moving. And as I just mentioned, I referred to Pentagon, the security establishment in the United States, they get this. They get, if we don't get this right, then what we are seeing with the refugees from, for instance, the Syrian civil war, with the background that I was referring to, suddenly being seen on E45 in Denmark, and refugees, a huge influx in Denmark and everywhere, that is only the beginning of what people who have studied this will sort of warn us against. So a lot is happening on the political front, and it means a lot for Paris coming up 3 weeks from now that the two big emitters are now moving. But maybe what gives me most sort of, I don't know if optimism is the right word, but I see some very interesting development in the fact that the investors globally are starting to think differently about climate. You know, it's not just sort of the green NGOs or some climate ministers here and there. One of those who these days are speaking most sort of sincerely and dedicated on why we need to act on climate change, that's the new CEO of Bank of England, Mark Carney. Who would have thought that? But he says, we are having long-term investments, and we have institutional investments, and we have pension funds, and, you know, we should be better at factoring in the risk of the things we invest in. So he will now start very clearly to recommend to his peers, we should invest less in coal plants and coal companies, oil companies, gas companies, but first and foremost coal companies. We should invest more in green technologies. We should invest more in renewables. And the interesting thing is that the way we have constructed this world, when does things really start to happen at scale? Yeah, it happened. It's good when you have a binding agreement globally on something. But if investors can see that it is economically not profitable to continue to invest the way you have been investing up till now, they will start to change investment patterns. And that is what we start to see. More and more companies, more and more pension funds start to divest, particularly from coal. American coal companies have lost 80% of their value since 2013. 80%. Whereas the renewables companies, they are actually gaining in strength, they are gaining value. I think that this change of our economic system, the economic investments, that is actually quite interesting. It might also come as a surprise to you that what I'm saying here we should be doing, setting up a target for climate, getting the pricing right, stopping subsidies to fossil fuels, all these things. That is now echoed by what OECD says and recommends to its members in the developed countries. That is what the World Bank says, the International Energy Agency, the IMF, and the leaders of these organizations, they will all sort of echo the same kind of message. I was in Davos at the World Economic Forum 2 years ago when Jim Kim was a newly selected sort of appointed president of the World Bank. And there is this tradition for the Friday lunch. It's for a sort of really distinguished guests and heads of states and finance ministers and what have you. And this new leader of the World Bank, he had been granted 10 minutes, it's January 2013, 10 minutes to give the state of the economy at the start of 2013. He spent 7 out of those 10 minutes talking about climate, telling these leaders, you haven't understood the dimension of this challenge. You're still investing too much into the society of yesterday instead of into the society that we need for tomorrow. So I'm just waiting for sort of seeing how this kind of thinking will trickle down to all national finance ministries and what have we around the planet. Two more aspects before I end. I think that one of the things that makes climate so difficult to handle is not only that it's a global challenge, but also in itself, it's an extremely complex challenge. You know, we have this tradition for organizing ourselves in silos. Our administrations, they have, they are organized around transport and buildings and energy and development and what have we. Where, and that is at the local level, that's at the state level, that is in the ministries, but that's also out in the companies. Where what we need is cross-cutting thinking. In order to address these complex challenges, we need to be able to sort of factor in co-benefits. If you do something in this area, there are co-benefits that sort of is good for other areas. If you sort of price externalities, it's not only good for if you have a more clean energy system, it's also good for air pollution. It might give you more interesting cities to live in if the transport is clean and if you have alternative means of transportation, things like that. There are co-benefits coming with these things. Our system is not very well suited for actually thinking in this cross-cutting way. And I could include academia. I know that here at the university, that would sometimes you would sort of meet across sort of the traditional disciplines, but I think you would agree that it's not to a very large extent that we are thinking interdisciplinary. When I'm thinking about what to do about climate, I think, we need to understand the natural sciences. We need to understand the economics and get the economics right. But as we were just discussing in there, we also need to understand social sciences, to understand the behavioral part. And I would say to someone like me, who's sort of politically speaking, a conservative, who would not like the state to be the one telling us, you must do that and you cannot do that and this is prohibited, it's extremely important to have this behavioral aspect also as part of the whole equation? What can make us as free citizens sort of just start doing some of these things? We discussed some of the solutions in there, but I think that we really need to think about this sort of different way of organizing ourselves, being a bit more cross-cutting, thinking more for the longer term. Politics today is so much sort of driven by short-termism. And that is also a paradox, because many of the challenges where we really need politics and cannot only leave it to the market, that would be short-term challenges. So there we need politics that also think for the shorter term. Let me finish just by saying I think, and that could maybe be interesting for the debate with you to hear some reflections on whether you agree on that. I think there is a paradigm shift on its way, not just that the world is starting to be serious about climate change and the environmental challenges, but I also think in sort of individual behavior, something interesting is happening. That we are moving more into sort of we should reuse and recycle, not just consume and throw away. As we were discussing in there, maybe you don't have to own everything yourself. What does that do to our normal way of thinking economy? Our normal production ways, our normal business models? We are in for some very substantial challenges there. The politicians, they can create the overall frame. Paris can do that internationally. EU could do that at the regional level. Nation states and cities can do it on their respective levels. Politicians can take care that the price signal is clear, and politicians must get the regulation right so that we sort of pull the market for new products faster. Business will have to come up with the solutions, and they of course also have to have the incentives to do so. But I would end by saying that I also think that it's incredibly important that we have some citizens that think that yes, we expect a lot from politics, from business, from decision makers, but we also accept that in the end we have an individual responsibility and our behavior actually means something. Just very finally, sometimes when I'm talking about these things and what is happening and what is not happening, I feel like, you know, in the movie Festen, it's before your time maybe, you still know what it is. There was this Festen, very famous Thomas Vinterberg movie, where they have this celebration of the father's 60th anniversary, and the son can make two speeches. He can make sort of the yellow speech and the green speech. And green has nothing to do with green, but that's the awful speech where he reveals all the secrets of the family. And that's of course what the movie is all about. And sometimes when talking about climate, I have this feeling I could also make both speeches, you know. There are really many things going in the wrong direction. There are still a lot of coal-fired plants being built. A lot of investments are done on a daily basis that sort of points more to the society of yesterday than to the society of tomorrow. But yet, on the other hand, I also see a lot of more fundamental things changing. And for instance, this divestment, investing, investment patterns starting to move. Politicians at the top level starting to get it. Maybe on a not so good background, because it's also because they see more and more evidence that climate change is actually happening. But at least slowly we start to get the message, and more start to understand that the sooner we start, the more of our lifestyle and our life as we know it we can keep. If we just postpone action, well, to put it a bit short, then we know who will be the ones to pay an ever-growing bill. I will stop with that, and then I really hope you will have questions answered. And I know we are using this tool, but Jørgen, maybe that's not the only thing we do. Thank you.
As well? Yeah, 1, 2, perfect. Well, the first question is actually not the top question, and it's a question that's not the question. I think it's just a statement. It says, will you ever see you in politics again? Have we ever not seen you in politics?
In Danish politics, no.
Yeah, well, Danish politics, no, but
No.
in international politics,
No, it's just...
you are a politician, aren't you? Even what you
No,
do today.
I'm a...
No, you don't.
Yeah, but there are many ways you can deal with politics. You do not always have to be a politician to deal with politics. So.
That's why
Yeah.
what I thought you would say. Okay, let's take the first one up here. Can you give one good reason not to be
Environmental
Thank you. You have,
and not to go green.
exactly. Not to agree.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're only thinking about short-term profits, I think you could still buy a coal mine or two. So I think, yes, there is an economic, probably an economic reason still to some. I do think, however, that those who are these years investing in renewables, they are doing better than those who are investing in oil and coal. There is a lot of evidence for that. But as long as we're talking only economics, yeah, you could still find some excuses if that is what you want to go for. Was that anonymous? No, it was Jakob. Yeah,
Jakob.
okay.
And by the way, both of us would like some hands in the air as well. Yeah, please.
I have a question about nuclear energy.
Yeah.
The new foreign reactors are involved, and the Chinese is not. It's been completely avoided this whole time. And I haven't heard it mentioned today at all. And even though this new technology has almost solved the problems with the waste, it's actually very abundant fuel. It's a waste product of refining all the metals in thorium. You see the Chinese jumping at the opportunity. Should the West kind of follow, or do you see us taking a different path? Isn't guided by the preconceptions of the past about how nuclear fuel is a bad thing?
Yeah.
And just to make sure that our tape gets us as well, just a short abbreviation of what was actually
Okay,
asked.
why is nuclear not mentioned? Is that not part of sort of the future solution, to give the short version of it? I think the reason why it has not been mentioned today probably is because in Denmark, and you're too young to know or to have experienced it, but some of us can remember the songs of the 70s and the 80s and the demonstrations, and it turned out to be almost a religious issue, you could say. So in Denmark, we just chose another system, renewables, and renewables with fluctuations do not go very well hand in hand with nuclear, because you cannot sort of, produce more or less. It produces what it produces. So that is why, for instance, gas or biomass, that is much more easy to integrate with renewables. So you could say in Denmark, this discussion was ended in the mid-80s in the Danish parliament. But globally, I think we need all the solutions that are there. I've said that always, also as a Danish environment minister. So I think that their nuclear will be a component, as you're mentioning China. There's just one misconception that I want to address. You didn't mention it, but some tend to believe that nuclear is the cheap solution. And there I have to say, no, it's not, because of the security standards being more and more tight and things like that. Take an example in England right now, Britain. They have this big new project, Hinkley Point. Actually, Cameron just signed the contract recently. With whom? With Xi Jinping, the Chinese. So the Chinese are now sort of running the future nuclear company for the Brits. And the whole business case hinges on having state subsidies on the double of the current energy tariff for 35 years. 35 years, until 2049, they will have to subsidize this plant. So it's just, in Finland they saw that it was quite an expensive solution, and they are now, they're almost halted. I think the third one that they built, they had to stop it because the costs were just running wild. So nuclear, globally, it's part of the solution. In parts of Europe also, some people are building it, and in some of the eastern new member states, they are replacing old Russian-style nuclear with modern nuclear, and that's probably a good thing, and the Commission will oversee that they can stress test them and that security is okay and all this. So I think that globally it is part of the conversation.
Yes?
Do you think Yeah, you're asking whether I think that in general politicians are preferring economic growth to improvements to the environment. When you phrase it like that, my question is yes, I think that most people, when it really comes to it, they will say, but we need economic growth. I just think that the point is that you have not necessarily to choose among the two. It can go hand in hand. Take Europe. Since 1990, in Europe, we have had a growth of GDP of 45%, while our emissions have decreased with 19%. Isn't it also interesting? What are the most prosperous countries on Earth, more or less? Those who always come out in the top 5 most attractive countries to invest in, most attractive countries to do business in, and so on. Norway, Denmark, Sweden. I mean, all of us, 3 countries who for 40 years have been serious about the environment. I think that few would argue that it has harmed our competitiveness to take good care of the environment. And I think actually that Denmark is an extremely good case, maybe one of the best cases in the world, that if you do this in the right manner, you can actually also create jobs, exports, income out of going green. Today we have 60,000 environmental sector jobs in Denmark. Many of them, by the way, in some rural areas where there are not so many other things, which is also interesting in another context, as the Danes in the room will understand. And I think that it is interesting that our export on green tech, clean tech, increased first half of this year with more than 18%, last year with 15 point somewhat %, while the average export last year grew 0.6%. The year before, in 2013, it grew by 17%, the clean tech exports. I think that is why, for instance, Confederation of Danish Industries, not just the green industries, the born green industries, but they realize that now we have had a lot of upfront cost. We have invested in this, and that was not a free thing to do. It cost us a lot, but we are actually benefiting from it now. And the price and cost of renewables, wind, solar, other things, is coming down these years dramatically. So more and more will demand these solutions. So I think that there is a good proof that you can take care of the environment and get your economic growth at the same time. As a counter picture, you could also use China, as I did, saying, if you are only focused on economic growth and forget about the environment, then you end up having really substantial troubles.
Yes, interesting, because it has to do about the governments as well. As you can see, do you think that the governments ultimately will have to secure sustainability by force, with car-free days or limitations, or do you actually think that it can be self-regulated at the level that Denmark is in at the moment, for example?
Yeah, I think that it has to be a mix. I think that there are some areas where it is better if we actually dare regulate it. Say standards for cars. It makes sense. Not to put a standard up and say tomorrow you have to do this and that, but to say to the car manufacturers, listen, we have a climate problem, we have an environmental problem, we have particle problems. Can we sit down, as we're doing with them in the EU context, can we try and sort of see what is the potential technology and what would be the costs? I mean, we made, while I was in the commission, and I was responsible for this new sort of set of regulations of cars. We could have done more. We could have regulated them even further, but then the cost would just, be too heavy. So to find the exact point where they say, oh, that will really stretch us, that is difficult, can we really do it? But it shows that normally, yes, when we, well in advance, they have 7 years production cycles, we say, okay, by 2020, and now we're in 2012 or 2011, you have to be there. Then they can pull it forces them to innovate. So that kind of regulation, I think, is wise.
And it leads us to exactly the next question. Why have COP21? Why not just make the companies do the
Yeah.
environmental.
But that is
changes.
because we are living in this interdependent world and with global competition, where governments would say, like also some would say in Europe, if we are doing this and our competitors, they are having a free ride, then it harms our competitiveness. So that has been also what has been holding many people back.
But you say that
And that's what
the European countries is actually having done this for 10 years
Yeah.
with the competitors not doing it, and still you have all the positive figures for it.
I agree, but I would also say that had it not been for the prospects of China and the US, the two big competitors also moving, I think the resistance in Europe would be even bigger. And some would sort of say, why don't we just sort of produce in the traditional way and just, it helps when they can see that their competitors are also moving now. China is introducing a national carbon price next year. It means something if you are in direct competition on producing steel or whatever with China. So in a global economy with global competition, I think that it makes sense to have the overall framework. But of course, it's not a very detailed. It's not telling you, this is what you must do as country A. It's more like saying, this is sort of what you promised to achieve in the reductions that is of interest for all of us, but how you will do it, that is of course up to yourself.
Any questions on government influence? No. Okay, let's go to the next one. Related to the after you attitude. Would you say that the earth is a captive in the political prisoner's dilemma? And what can we do to get out of this dilemma?
Well, I would say, I think that, there has been a lot of this after you. So, I can tell you how many negotiations I've been sitting in and what you listen to there. And, why should I? And you're not. And you could do more and we cannot. And, So in that sense, yes, that has slowed down action a lot. So what can we do to get out of this dilemma? In there we were discussing naming and shaming. And I think that goes for states as well. It's something in diplomacy you never do. It's just, you don't name, it's you who are the problem. In Durban in 2011, there was an International Climate Conference, the conferences that year. That was where we decided that we had to agree a new agreement in 2015. And that was the new thing, all countries, developed as well as developing, would have to be part of the regime, would have to be part of the responsibility, take their responsibility. And it was, China and India and Brazil and South Africa, they just hate this. They have been hiding behind this label as a developing country for a very long time, and that has suited them very well. But then, a few days before the conference was going to close, Brazil gave an opening. And then the day after, South Africa, who was hosting the meeting, they also got the question and they had to give an opening. And then I made this press conference and said, there's in international UN politics, South Africa, Brazil, China, and India, they are forming what they call the BASIC group. They're representing 2.5 billion people, so it's quite substantial. So I said, now we have half of BASIC countries, they have moved. So now we are only waiting for China and India and the United States, because we waited for them for another reason. And that was more or less unheard of that you mentioned them. And then we come down in plenary and you could see the Chinese delegation sitting there and the Indian delegation, and it had been said, who is it that we are waiting for? Shaming and naming and shaming can be quite an interesting tool that can also be used to push countries to move their position. The Chinese definitely did not like that they got some of the blame from Copenhagen not being a success. And if there's one thing they have promised themselves, I can tell you, that is Paris should not happen likewise, that the blame ends up with China. So that's why it means something at the international arena if you can sort of point to, what are you doing? What are you doing? Samoa can do it, small island state. You are India, and you say 3 years will not be time enough for you to get ready? What are you talking about? They have 5 ministers or whatever in Samoa to take care of the whole country, and they have 3 civil servants in the environment ministry. If they can do it, why can you not do it? So, I mean, also to play it a bit more direct, that can help. So naming and shaming does not only sort of work with individuals, also with states.
You're unchanged about not being a politician?
Yeah.
Now, there was a question about you being a prime minister and doing one thing for the environment in Denmark. But let's say no, not the prime minister, but if you got to decide, had one wish here, and you can say one thing that Denmark should do that would be on your wish list number 1, what would that be?
Then I would do something that doesn't cost a thing. That would make the prime minister happy. That is to stop talking about this as if it's something that is very, very expensive and very, very difficult and very, very, this is about opportunities also. If you get it right, it's also about opportunities. And I would sort of try and make people understand, listen, we have a choice. We can have the cost this way when we see the consequences, or we can sort of invest in avoiding some of these consequences. Try to make that part of the conversation, and not just every time your ministers are talking about it, say, oh, it's so expensive. I don't think that's
a little bit more concrete. I mean, a little bit more, some laws, or something that you would,
I don't know if you're aiming at something there. For instance, I would stop reducing the innovation budget and the research budget. Because, yeah, I thought so. and your paper's editorial was looking for it today. But
blame me for trying.
No, but honestly, now also here at Aarhus University, I mean, we can see, I'm at the board of the university, we can see how much it will mean in years to come that research funding is slashed. And I'm not against that you have balanced budget. But I just think that in Denmark, when China and Germany and the US and other very, very big players now start to get this, we are very naive if we think they are not contesting our competitive advantage in these areas. And one thing you can say for sure about China is when they decide to prioritize something, then they do it, and they do it fast. We saw it with solar. Germany had invested a lot in solar, and the Chinese could, just like this, take their markets. I mean, you have to protect your front-runner position by innovating, being even better at innovating. In Denmark, we cannot be good at, the cost of labor per hour or number of holidays or whatever. There we will lose to the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Koreans and what have we. But we must be good at innovation. So if I were Prime Minister, I think that would be where I would sort of put my money.
Okay. Now back to some more politicians here. What, in your opinion, about the Danish government increasing the taxes on electric cars? Is that motivating green transition?
No.
Next question.
No. I was a minister when we introduced to sort of exempt electrical cars for the big sort of taxes that we have on cars in Denmark. And to be honest, at that time, I think we thought that we could have a faster take-in of electrical cars. I would say you should not be subsidizing things forever, also not electrical cars. But it would be good to have sort of seen that the uptake was a bit bigger before you then cut the subsidies. And we can see that now the infrastructure starts to get in place, so people are actually interested in buying it. So I think it's not a perfect timing. Once again, it's not a perfect timing.
But when you were in office, were you then thinking, wow, I hope not that 25% of the cars next year would be electric, because then we would reduce our revenues from the cars?
That's true. That's a true dilemma. When you have a big revenue to the state coming from taxation of cars, and you exempt some, at some point you will have a gap in the budget if you're not careful. So of course you cannot, or should not, subsidize it until you have 20 or 25% of the cars being electrical. But maybe you should do it until you have 2% or 3%, and then you should phase down the support, and then you should have the mechanisms in place. So it's not that I say you should subsidize forever. Take wind. Wind has been subsidized in Denmark. But of course, people like me would say, yeah, but the day, and now it's coming for onshore wind, that it can compete on market terms, you should of course phase down the subsidies. When it's a mature technology, of course, phase down the technology. But we should be better at subsidizing immature technologies, at least if we want to have good products coming faster from the laboratory, from the good idea, to the market where we can start to sort of earn money on that. But for instance, when I was a commissioner, we made for all of Europe this change in the way you can subsidize in Europe, saying when you have mature technologies, phase out the subsidies. Of course, solar, it can compete now on market terms. Kilowatt hour wind is now down to 4 US cents. Doesn't go into, I mean, what does that say? But it's very, very cheap. Then you should not subsidize it. Leave it to the market. But you have to help it to a certain point and then leave it to the market.
Well, actually, I will go 4 questions down here, just to talk about the Russians' role in climate development. When we exclude a country that big, which was that much oil, what happens to the environment?
It's a very, very interesting question. Is this something that is that for press, or do you suddenly get into a fight with Russia if you sort of get into too many details here? I'm saying this because Russia is always playing a very particular role in these talks. They have this tendency, these talks normally take 12 days, and then they should stop Friday at midnight, and sometimes it runs into Saturday and Sunday and what have we in Durban. I slept 4 hours from Thursday morning to Sunday night. But then you have Russia being silent for the first 10 days or so. They don't say anything. And normally in this system, if you don't protest, you are on board. And then we normally say we have the Russian show at the last night, because then the party starts, and then you have all sorts of things coming from Russia that often their negotiators traditionally, they're not speaking English. So, and that's of course not their fault, but it makes it more difficult to understand because we are not speaking Russian. So what do you do? So many nights I have spent with this Russian thing, trying to understand what is it that they want? What is it that they are unhappy with? Who can we call? How can we solve this? And of course, this year in Paris, you will imagine, with the French foreign minister, Fabius, being the COP president in the seat, with a crisis between Europe and Russia over Ukraine and over Syria. That is one of the unknown factors for Paris. How will that spill out? Because there's not sort of a very good hotline between, for instance, the European host to Moscow, if need be, and say, can we find a solution to this? So Russia is a difficult player in all this. And Russia has a lot of hot air. It's a lot of technical things, but things they never polluted, but that they sort of have in the bank. So they can pollute a lot and still not have to reduce anything. So Russia is a special case. How to bring them on board? The very ironic thing about Russia is up in Siberia, where they have some of the very big gas fields. The infrastructure, the pipes, they are now sinking because of the tundra is melting. So the gas infrastructure and the oil infrastructure is sort of being undermined by climate change. That is ironic, isn't it? It was built on ice. And when all that starts to melt, plus the tundra itself can release a lot of methane, so Russia is in for rather challenging things in years to come.
Okay. The next question, or the top question, I would like to direct into the American policies that are going on at the moment, and it is how do the community tackle national leaders who ignore or don't believe in the climate crisis, and that try to put it into an American context.
Yeah.
If you can.
Yeah, that is of course interesting, because what do you do? America is an open society, democracy. their democratic leaders cannot agree on this. And in the US, contrary to in Europe, it has turned into a totally partisan issue. Republicans here, Democrats here. It was not like that 6 or 7 years ago. It was a bit more bipartisan. Now it has been sort of, after the Tea Party, it has been Republicans, no climate issues. Democrats, yeah, we have to do something about it. So what can you do? Because you can scream as much as you want as a European minister or a commissioner. It doesn't help. The Congress will say, these bloody Europeans, and look at their crisis. And so you will try to work through big American companies, some of whom are very concerned about these things, and who can see that also the US have to move. That would be some of the things you can do. You will try and work through sort of the media. You will try and support, for instance, KR.
The political system.
Not bypass, but why is it that Congress cannot decide anything? That's because Congress members are getting so enormous amount of money from the fossil lobby industry. So you have to sort of go through some of the other industries. And that is what is happening now also with Obama. You know, some very big philanthropists, the Rockefellers and Tom Steyer and many other big money people, Bill Gates, many others, they are sort of throwing some money in here to counterbalance the lobbyism from very, very strong oil and coal and gas interests. So that is at least part of what you can be doing. And then you can also work with some of the people in the administration, because in the American system, for instance, their Environmental Protection Agency, they can actually do quite some legislation here, or regulation, but it has the same effect. So even though they cannot get things through Congress, they can at least get it out there, starting maybe to come into effect. But then it can end up in their court system and a lot of other things. So it's complicated when you have a democratic, big society where the politicians, where it's ideology. And if we are coming to a close very soon, I'll just say that is one. I thought so. But that is why. What's the big difference from Denmark and some of the other countries? In Australia also, they have a totally sort of polarized debate on these things. You know, you will sometimes not believe it when you are there. I think that tells me that the big advantage we have had in Denmark on these things, and one of the reasons why we are frontrunners and acknowledged as such, is that we have managed not to make this a too much ideological question. That we have had broad agreements from a wide sort of range of parties behind our energy policy, because the thinking has been, if an investor invests something and take the risk of something that pays off in a 30, 40 years time, they need to know what are the conditions. So we cannot have stop-go politics, because if you have stop-go politics, you won't get the investments. So this broad agreement we have had in Denmark traditionally on these issues is part of, I would argue, why we have come so far and the Americans only have started on this journey.
Perfect. There's two things. First of all, we have to listen to you in a second, but first of all, give a hand for Connie.